Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Dan Clark. We are finally here. Election day is Tuesday. If you caught the show last week, we answered your questions about Prop 1, the Environmental Bond Act. But this week, we're giving you a final look at the state's top races. When you head to the polls Tuesday, you'll vote in New York's statewide elections. Those are for governor, U.S. Senate, state attorney general, and state controller. You'll also decide members of the state legislature. And this year, those races are different. Take a look. It's an unusual election year in New York. Democrats, usually confident in what's considered a deep blue state, are now playing defense, just days away from the election. And it starts at the top of the ticket in the race for governor. Governor Kathy Hochul is hoping voters elect her to a full term. She's been in office since last August, when former Governor Andrew Cuomo resigned over claims of sexual misconduct.
I want people to believe in their government again. It's important to me that people have faith. Our strength comes from the faith and the confidence of the people who put us in these offices, and I take that very seriously.
She's running against Congressman Lee Zeldin, the Republican nominee, and polls show the race tighter than Democrats anticipated. A recent poll from Siena College had Hochul up by 11 points, and another poll from Quinnipiac showed just a 4-point margin. Hochul's pitching voters on her experience as governor, lieutenant governor, a member of Congress, and more.
I've been your governor. It's the highest honor of my life the last 14 months. Every single day I wake up thinking about how I can fight harder for you and your families, to invest in education for your kids, give you more child care opportunities so you can get back to your jobs.
But Zeldin has been a strong campaigner. Polls show crime and the economy as top issues for New York voters, and he centered his campaign around both.
This is everything for all New Yorkers of all stripes. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, a conservative, a moderate, a liberal. All New Yorkers are hitting their breaking point right now, and they are desperate for us to be successful in this effort to restore balance in Albany.
He's focused in recent months on New York City and its suburbs, hoping independents and even moderate Democrats will side with him. He wants to boost funding for law enforcement and undo recent criminal justice changes at the state level. And while data shows no connection between those changes and the state's rise in crime, Zeldin says it's about a culture shift.
We can continue with the status quo where they believe they haven't passed enough pro-criminal laws, or we can take control of our destiny and make sure law-abiding New Yorkers are in charge of our streets again.
And that's just the top of the ticket. Senator Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York, who's the current majority leader of the U.S. Senate, is getting a challenge from media personality and Republican political strategist Joe Pinion. Pinion is hoping voters are tired of Schumer, who's been in Congress for 40 years.
Because he is, in fact, an exceptional politician, one of the best that has ever lived. He's a failed senator. He has failed the people of this state on multiple occasions.
But Schumer wants to flip that message. He says his experience is a plus, and that as Senate Majority Leader, he's an asset to New York.
For example, people always used to decry that New York sent more money to Washington than we got back. For the first time under my leadership, we got more money back than we sent to Washington.
Further down the ticket, Republican Michael Henry wants to be New York's next Attorney General.
I would be more cognizant of the taxpayer dollars as the Attorney General. I would not waste taxpayer dollars on lawsuits that really don't have standing or done more for political purposes, and I would evaluate everything in the best interest of the taxpayer of the state of New York.
But to do that, he'll have to unseat the current AG, Tish James, a Democrat from Brooklyn. Henry says that James hasn't done enough to combat crime, though it should be noted that the AG's office doesn't have the power to prosecute and sometimes investigate without a referral. The office is more involved with civil cases, like in September when James sued former President Donald Trump over alleged business fraud.
Everyday people cannot lie to a bank about how much money they have in order to get a favorable loan to buy a home or to send their kid to college. And if they did, the government would throw the book at them. Why should this be any different?
Voters will also decide the race for state controller, a relatively unknown position that audits state spending and revenue and manages the public pension fund. The incumbent is Tom DiNapoli, a Democrat. He's been in office for 15 years, making him one of the longest-serving state controllers in state history. And like Hochul, he's selling voters on his experience.
We live in such a polarized time, and folks sometimes get sidetracked. Social media or slogans or, don't want to hear the details. Well, I think we need to have more thoughtful discussion about all these issues. They're complex.
But he's getting a challenge this year from Paul Rodriguez, the Republican candidate. Rodriguez spent his career in the state's banking industry before recently moving over to development for the Archdiocese. He says DiNapoli hasn't used the powers of the Comptroller's office to their fullest extent.
What I think one of the biggest challenges is that I don't think that very powerful bully pulpit that is the Comptroller's office is utilized well and efficient enough.
And at the local level, voters will also choose members of the state legislature. While the Assembly is traditionally a Democratic stronghold, Republicans are hoping to pick up ground in the state Senate or even take the majority. That could change the dynamic in Albany when lawmakers return for the new legislative session in January. And you may also see other local races on the ballot, like judgeships, DA, and more. But let's look into our crystal balls for next week with Yancey Roy from Newsday and Anna Grunwald from Politico. Thank you both for being here. So I want to start with you, Yancey. I said at the top of that story that it's been an unusual election year in New York. I'm wondering if you agree. To me, it's been strange because we see closer gaps in races. We also see a kind of different dynamic, maybe even different than 2 years ago. What do you think?
Well, in some ways, the overview is that it is a typical year in that any kind of off-year election year usually bodes well for the party that doesn't hold the White House, which right now is Republicans. But it is different in many ways. Like you said, first of all, the governor's race is as close as it's been in 28 years, since 1994. So there's that. And also what's changed, and this has changed not just, I think, in New York, but other states, is the whole, nationalization of issues, nationalization of elections, where you see local races such as Senate and Assembly and even lower candidates talking about topics that are national in theme and not necessarily as much, your local issues. So there's sort of an overview, an overlay, if you will, of broad themes across the states, across sort of the ballot, if you will.
And I think it's almost easier for Republicans to campaign on that stuff right now, right? Because Democrats are in control, as you said, in the White House and in Congress. But here in New York, Democrats are in control of the legislature, the governor's office, and kind of the state court system. So for them, really their campaign this year has to be, is your life better or is it not? And these are the people in power, get them out. That's their message, and I think it's been really effective. Anna, you interviewed the governor last week or the week before. I think it was last week, but everything's kind of blending together in these final days of the election. What was her tone like? What was her vibe with you? We had her on in August. I'm wondering, did she feel confident going into these final days to you?
She's certainly projecting confidence, and she had a rally that we were at last 2 nights ago, I believe, and she was as, I think, energetic as I've seen her. That might just be adrenaline in the final days of campaign. But when we interviewed, it was shortly after a couple of polls that had come out showing that Zeldin was actually a lot closer than maybe some of the previous polls had predicted.
Yeah.
And we had asked her about that, and her classic line is, I always run like an underdog, I'm not looking at the polls. But she and her team were very clearly pivoting towards some of the issues that Zeldin had been using in his campaign, trying to make a stronger case for her ability to get guns off the street and to tackle public safety issues. And that was something that came up in our interview, and it also is something that, following that, became a much stronger message on her part.
Yancey, do you think that Lee Zeldin has a chance at this? I mean, the polls are very close.
Yeah, sure.
And I think there is, for Democrats, this feeling still that he does not have a chance. And to me, I'm looking at the polls and seeing the way that things are trending. And it looks like he does have a good shot at this. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, I think he does absolutely has a shot in this. A lot of it will depend on get out the vote efforts over the next couple of days, with early voting still going this weekend, and also on Tuesday. And to go back to one thing that Anna mentioned, Governor Hochul said she takes this as an underdog. Well, you know what? She hasn't been running like an underdog at all, and they've only kicked in the gear recently on some of these issues. So I think it is moved. In some ways, it's amazing that it's moved from the poll that came right after Labor Day, 17-point lead for Hochul, all the way down to, depending on which poll you look, single digits, and people saying, hey, we're not sure how this is going to turn out. So it's going to be really important for Democrats and Republicans to really churn their base and say, don't sit this one out, go vote.
Yeah, that's interesting, because to me, as I look at this, and I think you're exactly right, it seems like Democrats really only started to take this seriously in the past month or so. It seems like before that, at least in my opinion, Democrats really were not campaigning in a strong way around the state, especially the governor, the state attorney general basically has no campaign because she feels very confident, I'm assuming. The comptroller doesn't really have a campaign because he feels very confident, I'm assuming. Anna, what do you think that leads to? Do you think that this is a situation where we could have Democrats turn out in lower numbers because of that? Or, I don't know, will a last kind of day's message work?
Well, we'll see what happens, how this final push has played out. But I do know we were looking at some numbers yesterday, and we saw that as far as ad buys and TV pushes over the past month or so since those polls came out, Democrats and Republicans are spending about equally. And I think that's a hugely different dynamic to see Republicans have a ground game and a spending game in the millions just as much as the Democrats do in the final days. And I don't think that anyone was prepared for that or has been prepared over the past year.
And I think that, it's interesting, you mentioned the statewide candidates like AG, Comptroller, Governor had been kind of not having much of a campaign. In contrast, I think that the ground level Assembly and Senate people of the Democrats have actually been out there pretty aggressively. And you talk about coattails. I think one interesting thing that might happen this year, or that strategists are talking about, is sort of a reverse coattails. To go back to what we talked to in the beginning, there's like this national overlay of issues. And if there's a sentiment for Republican control of Congress, and people want to, hey, I'd like to see a Republican Congress, that they might vote up the ticket, okay, and now I'll also maybe vote for the Republican at the top of the ticket. So, I think in some ways the battle for Congress is kind of pushing things up the ballot, or it could. We'll see how it works this time.
That's really, and so that's Long Island. I think that might be the case upstate too, but I have no idea. Anna, what do you think? Have you been watching these upstate races? It's okay if you haven't. Because I have, but it's also very confusing because of redistricting. So when I'm talking about like the 19th congressional district, in my head I'm thinking of where it is, but it's not where it is anymore. So I just have no idea. What's your sense?
Thank God for the CUNY project that remaps all of them. I visit that website every single day. I think that it's very similar to what Yancey has suggested, that there is there's confusion over what exactly the turnout might look like, and there's also confusion over which issues are actually resonating with people. Some national issues like abortion may or may not be resonating as strong. Some national issues like inflation and crime may or may not be. And I think we have we have a couple of races that are looking to be very close. I know Sean Patrick Maloney in the new 17th is definitely feeling some heat, and we have a couple of open seats as well that are true toss-ups. I think there's some of the few true toss-ups in the country, and that's very strange to see in a very blue state like New York.
It's interesting because we have these issues like crime and inflation that are so important to voters. It seems that those are universal issues. And when we look at polling, those are at the top of the list of important issues. And in some of the polls, you see abortion, at least in terms of New York voters, as a lower issue, I think, because people think that there is no threat to their abortion rights here. But then I get emails and stuff from viewers who say, this is my #1 issue. So it's just an interesting dynamic with everything that is on everyone's plate this year. So it'll be really interesting to see Tuesday. We're out of time. Anna Grolwald from Politico, Yancey Roy from Newsday, thank you both so much. And if you want more on Tuesday's elections, check out our website. Our digital team put together a great voter resources page that's free to explore ahead of Tuesday. As always, that's at nynow.org.